Good morning. The first week of seminary, you begin a year-long survey course on the Old Testament. Usually then in your second year, you then begin a year-long survey course on the New Testament, then you spend your third year sort of going into more details and where your interest is. And so when I started seminary, first semester, my first class that I was going to sit in was this Old Testament survey, and I got the list of books, and I went down to the seminary bookstore. I was kind of excited. It's kind of fun to buy books, but it's also kind of expensive to buy academic books. I mean, books for a semester are hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And so I was a little miffed that my Old Testament professor had assigned us a translation of the Old Testament that almost none of us had. It was the Jewish Publication Society's Tanakh translation of the Old Testament. And I was like, I'm spending a lot of money here, and I have a shelf of Bibles. Right? Anyone that goes to seminary is going to have a shelf of Bibles. I have every translation you can. I don't have the Jewish one. And so I was a little bit like, do I really have to buy this one? It's like $40. All right, so I bought it, went to the first class, and the professor addressed it. And she said something to the effect like, I know you all have Bibles, and I know you all have probably read the Old Testament before, and here's why I want you to have this new translation. I want you to read it afresh and anew. I don't want you to just have this comfortable words and this comfortable translation that you are so used to. I want you to feel like you're out of your element. And I loved that. And so ever since, I have more shelves of Bibles now because I keep buying them. Over the past 10 years, there's been a bunch of really interesting translations of the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Gospels. Most of these ones that come out frequently aren't like the translation that we read on Sunday morning from the New Revised Standard Version, which was done by a committee of hundreds of scholars. I mean, it was probably the work of 1,000 people or more to put together the translation we use every Sunday. Well, you can't always do that if you want to translate something. So there's all these translations that are by one person, by one scholar, and they're interesting. And I use them in my own prayer life, and they're helpful specifically when you have a passage that is so familiar that it's comfortable, like the prologue to John, or the 23rd Psalm, or the parable of the prodigal son, or the Beatitudes. There's a brand new, the ebook version came out a couple weeks ago. The paper version hard copy version doesn't come out until February 14th. I know what I want for Valentine's Day. And it's a new translation by a scholar named Sarah Rudin, who isn't known as a Bible translator. She's just known as a translator of ancient texts, and she's done a whole library of books of translations, and she has translated the New Testament into just the Gospels into a word-for-word translation. And I thought I included it in the bulletin online. You can scroll up underneath sermon. It has her translation of just the Beatitudes. And I'm just going to read it through kind of quickly. I could offer commentary. I'm not going to. But I just want you to hear it afresh. I want, like my Old Testament professor, I want you to be knocked a little bit outside of your comfort zone. So here we go. Happy are those destitute in the life breath, because theirs is the kingdom of the skies. Happy are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Happy are the gentle, for they will be heirs of all the earth. Happy are those starving and parched for justice, because they will have as much as they can eat. Happy are those who show mercy, because they will be shown mercy. Happy are those who are pure at heart, because they will see God. Happy are the makers of peace, because they will be called sons of God. Happy are those hounded for the sake of justice, because theirs is the kingdom of the skies. I think it's good for us to sort of like be jolted by some of those words, these words that are so familiar, to like have them be so unfamiliar, because this happens to many biblical texts, but perhaps particularly the Beatitudes. They've become like a very sweet and lovely thing. We read them at weddings. We read them at funerals. You can find them on greeting cards and, cross-stitched onto pillows. They're just very sweet and lovely and beautiful. Oh, the Beatitudes. And when Jesus climbed to the top of the mountain and he began his first sermon, his inaugural act of his ministry, I don't think he intended something sweet and lovely and just beautiful. When the people who took the day off from work, which was not really a thing you did back then, and then climbed up a mountain to listen to him, I don't think they went there because they wanted to hear something really sweet. When Matthew wrote these words down in his gospel, I don't think he was intending them to come across to sound sweet and lovely. And when Matthew's church, when they heard these words read, or they read them for themselves, I don't think they saw them as sweet. You know that in Jesus' day, around 30 AD, his country, his land, was a mess. They were utterly oppressed by a foreign power who controlled every aspect of their lives and only sought to get more and more power over their lives. And they felt, and we know from just reading the ancient forebears, that they felt oppressed. There was an anxiety, there was an urgency about their situation. And so when Jesus begins his first sermon in that situation, he wasn't just trying to here's something sweet for you. He's speaking to people who are desperate and who need something of substance. They climbed that mountaintop on that day to hear something of substance that spoke to them. Matthew, when he's writing this down, probably 4 decades later after the Sermon on the Mount is given, you know that Matthew and his church are in Syria. Jerusalem has been destroyed by the Romans. They are off. They're refugees in a foreign land in Syria. They've lost their land, their freedom, their entire way of life, their entire way of worship. Like everything has been turned upside down. They weren't looking for something sweet and lovely either. They weren't looking for a new thing to put on a pillow. They needed to hear words that were meaningful. And that is what I believe these words were. And it's what I believe these words, how they were heard when they were first heard. And I think it's how we're meant to hear them too. Jesus begins, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," or as Sarah's translation is, happy are those who are destitute for the life breath. It's a notoriously hard to understand verse. I think in this context, it means happy are the desperate. Happy are the heartbroken. Happy are those who are, empty. I think Jesus, as he utters these words to these people who have climbed this mountain to hear him, he is speaking to everyone there because they are all desperate. They are all heartbroken. They are all empty. His next words are, "Blessed are those who mourn." And again, he's speaking to every single person there. Mourning perhaps for those who they've lost at the hands of the Roman army, but probably also mourning for the loss of their life, their freedom, a future for their children. Heartbroken, lost, empty. He's speaking directly to them. At the very end when he says, happy are those, in the middle, happy are those starving and parched for justice. Every single soul in front of Jesus on that mountaintop was hungry and parched for justice. Every single soul reading those words in Matthew's community was starving and parched for justice. And so I think every one of those people, they weren't thinking, oh, this is lovely, got to make a card out of this. This will look good on a sticker. I think they're thinking, this man is speaking directly to me. For the first time, I feel like someone is speaking to me about this situation. But then the rest of the words are, I think, a little challenging, or maybe even a lot challenging. Remember, people who are suffering from oppression and degradation, the likes of which we probably can't even fathom. Jesus says, blessed are you who are gentle, you who show mercy, you who are pure at heart, you who are makers of peace. When we have our backs against the wall, when we are scared, when we are angry, when we are upset, when we are anxious, when we are depressed, we don't usually look for those things. Right? I think the people would have been much happier if Jesus had spoken words looking for harshness and for revenge and for conflict making. Let's take this place over. We're going to take this place back. We know that there were people in Jesus' day who were looking for a Messiah. In those days, no one was looking for a Messiah to bring life after death. No one was looking for a Messiah that was going to take them to heaven. They were looking for someone who was going to rescue them and their nation, reestablish the throne of David, and make Israel into the nation that God had originally planted it for. The people who are suffering under Roman oppression and degradation were waiting for a Messiah to save them and their country. And Jesus says, mercy, gentleness, peace. I'd like to think that as he spoke these Beatitudes, that there was like a murmuring through the crowd. Like what'd he say? What? That doesn't... I must have misheard him, because that's right. That can't be right. Blessed are the cheesemakers? Is that what he said? Because that'd be better than the peacemakers. Sorry. Paul deals with this in our epistle lesson today when he talks about how to outsiders looking in, the gospel looks like foolishness and weakness. God came down from heaven to earth in a human, frail form and then died. That sounds like weakness. God comes and teaches people who are oppressed and down to just look for mercy and comfort and gentleness. That sounds like weakness. But Paul says, in that weakness is actual strength. In what looks like foolishness is actually wisdom. These words were a challenge to God's people. And yet, it's a challenge that over the last 2,000 years has rarely been lived into. Every once in a while, there'll be a saint that we can lift up, a Saint Francis, a Mother Teresa, and be like, wow, this person of mercy and comfort and peace and gentleness, they're a hero. and we extol them, and we give them titles, and we paint paintings of them, but then rarely do we emulate them. Which is why we can put little statues of St. Francis everywhere, right? Because otherwise we have to put statues of all of us everywhere. But he did it. Maybe I don't have to. It's a challenge that we rarely taken up. These words, and so we turn these words into something that's sweet and lovely and beautiful, instead of seeing it as a call to arms. Those people back then lived in a desperate time, and I would suggest that while if they came to us today, if we brought them, time traveled them 2,000 years later, there is so much of our world they would not understand, right? Phones, Wi-Fi, flight, but if we got to sit down and talk with them, our worlds aren't that much different. The world 2,000 years ago and the world today are still ruled by harshness and revenge, impurity, and conflict making. And I have so many questions. I mean, very often I'll preach a sermon like this about the Beatitudes or maybe the teachings of forgiveness or love your neighbor, and I'll be met at the back door with a great question, but what about Hitler? Right? You can't meet Hitler with gentleness and mercy. And right. Today we might say, but what about Ukraine? You can't meet Putin with just gentleness and mercy. And you're right. I have questions about how do we balance the starving for justice with mercy. When I watch a video of a young man be beaten to death while people stand around and watch, how do you offer justice and mercy at the same time? And I don't know. I have so many questions. And a lot of my questions surround how do we do this collectively? How do we collectively meet a tyrant? How do we collectively meet evil with mercy and gentleness while also holding up justice? And I don't know. But I do know that there are places in my life where I could be more merciful. There are places in my life, in my family, in my social circle that could have more peace brought to them. I know there are situations in my life where I could be more gentle. I know there are situations where I could stand up and say, no, this situation requires justice. I haven't, the macro level of this, I don't know. But Monday morning, 9 a.m., Tuesday afternoon, 3 p.m., I feel is a little clearer. When I think about the situations that I'm dealing with, the things that worry me, the things that keep me up at night, the things that wake me up in the morning, I see where I could bring the Beatitudes to bear. And perhaps you do too. These words are a challenge to remake our world to look more and more like God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And we're not going to figure it all out, and we're always going to think of a situation where this isn't going to work and that isn't going to work, but we can also be people who bring grace. Amen.